Welcome to the National College Podcast, where we dive into the latest education trends, discuss best practice, and highlight important updates in the education sector. My name is Eleanor Adams, and today we're going to be exploring the incredibly important topic of knife crime. We will be discussing a real event of knife crime and the devastating impact that this has had on the Stevens family. So listener discretion is advised. I'm joined by Anoushka, who is the Training Programmes Manager at the Ben Kinsella Trust, and by Amanda Stevens, who is the mother of Olly Stevens, a 13-year-old boy who was tragically murdered in January 2021. So Amanda, thank you so much for being here. I really can't imagine the pain and suffering that your family must have been through with the death of Olly, but I really wanted to say thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing Olly's story with us. And I wondered if you'd like to just start by telling us about Olly. What was he like?
Olly was a real larger-than-life character. He really fitted in as much as he could into any day. If he liked something, he loved it. He had so many different hobbies. He would love to watch films, listen to music. He loved baking and cooking. He loved his friends. He was really good fun to be around.
He sounds like he was a really active boy, and he had a lot of different interests and a lot of different things that were going on in his life that were really positive.
There was so much that was positive, but I can't help but go back to the transition really into going to secondary school. And prior to that, Olly getting a mobile phone because he wanted to walk to primary school on his own with a friend. And we saw such a change really in Olly. And he really, really struggled in that transition to secondary school. And within 14 months of being at secondary school, he had an autism spectrum diagnosis.
So it was really in that transition then from primary to secondary that things started to change. Can you tell us about what happened to Olly?
Mm-hmm. It was really quite a free fall. I can look back on that time over like a year and a half on joining secondary school. That first of all, he was being told off because of his behaviour. But when he was at home, he was really struggling with his self-esteem and with low mood. And we at that time were trying to understand what had happened from being really quite a happy-go-lucky boy at primary school, very much loved, to be in the sort of distress that he was in when he was at home. It just was a major change. And I think as a family, we were really trying to understand what was wrong, and we were trying to get up to speed very quickly with neurodiversity. But what we weren't so quick to get our heads around and almost were blindsided by was him becoming criminally exploited and pulled into a gang.
Right. So are you able to tell us a little bit more about that in particular? So you'd mentioned the change from him having a mobile phone and I assume then the access to social media. Was that linked then to that criminal exploitation?
It's hard to tell. I certainly don't feel like it wasn't a contributing factor. I think if he hadn't have been online, he wouldn't have got to meet some people and he wouldn't have learnt about things that almost desensitized him, I think, to what was happening around him and made some of the things that he was seeing become as if that was the real world to him. It was acceptable. It was understood that that was the way things were.
Yeah. Anoushka, can I bring you in here for a second? So we've been recording a course today about knife crime awareness, and that's something that you've talked about is how social media can have a desensitizing impact for children and young people. Is that something that you've seen and experienced?
Yeah, so the algorithms on certain social media platforms will direct certain material towards users, not just because of their demographics, but because of their age, their gender, their location. And we see young people interacting with material online that we as adults might be shocked by. We would perhaps say that it was knife crime. We see people handling weapons online. Young people wouldn't necessarily think that that was knife crime or offensive or harmful, they might view it as, this is normal for us, this is what life is like. And they might be seeing a really skewed version of reality when we actually know, 99% of young people don't carry knives. But that's not what the narrative is online.
That's really interesting to hear, and that skewed vision of reality. Amanda, I wonder if we could change and talk a little bit about Olly's neurodiversity. Was there anything there that you feel meant that he wasn't able to understand some of the things that was happening to him?
So much. And I think he was really very, very vulnerable. And as parents, that's what was worrying us the most, because he had no understanding of danger. He would brush off danger as if there was no concern. He also had a very unusual understanding, I guess, of what he thought was a friendship. And yes, he had some absolutely wonderful, genuine friends, but he was coming across young people that weren't his friends. But for some reason in his mind, he thought that they were, and that was the worry. He couldn't understand that those individuals were not good for him.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to tell us more about the events leading up to Olly's death, if that's okay for you to share?
Definitely. So Olly had, during that sort of year and a half of before he died, he'd struggled at secondary school. We'd been pushing for a diagnosis, which only came just before he passed. At school, he was really struggling in class, and he didn't want to be in class because his autism diagnosis showed that he was struggling with his listening skills and his being able to remember. So quite quickly he felt uncomfortable in a classroom and wanted to be out of that. And so he would go AWOL within the grounds or wanted to go to the Star Centre, which is somewhere where children in distress could go to. So the reaction to the school to Olly's, as they would say, behaviour was to put him into focus, so take him out of class or to exclude him for a day or two. What that led to was Olly feeling more and more uncomfortable in school, not feeling welcomed in school, not feeling understood in school, missing out on time with his friends, and really quite alienating him. He also, with his diagnosis, had a very strong sense of right and wrong, really stuck up for his friends to the point where he got himself into trouble quite regularly because he wouldn't put up with anybody being bullied. So before Olly passed, he had become excluded from his secondary school, and we were at the point of looking for a new place for him to go to school, and trying to see how we could support him best. But he was quite vulnerable at that point, not being in the normal confines of a school environment, more time away at home. And something I hadn't mentioned but was really key is that we were going through lockdown. So it was the year of lockdown. So there was time anyway for everybody out of school, and not being in that same routine. But Olly's world became really quite small. And in that world, there was a girl who was his friend, who was probably a regular contact for him to have. And he would see his friends really not so often, a bit more nearer the end of the time because things were getting a little bit more relaxed. But yeah, he was cut off, and we were cut off as well in lots of ways, trying to cope with this at home.
Yeah. And just as, many of our listeners are educators, and they may be hearing this and maybe thinking, gosh, that really doesn't sound good for Olly when he was in school and when there weren't lockdowns. What do you wish the approach had been from his school in terms of accepting his neurodivergence, and what would have been a better response perhaps than just to isolate him?
I think it was to look for more support, really. And I think on the odd occasion where he did go into focus, he would be more one-to-one with a teacher. And actually out of those interactions, he'd come back and say, oh, I did this today. And I think it's hard as a parent. It doesn't get picked up on so often in primary school because of the nature of an autism diagnosis. If there is not too much change and things are quite structured, they can manage to cope. And in Olly's case, there was always a TA who would say, did you understand that, Olly, and help him along. And at the minute he got to secondary school, there wasn't that type of support. So I think it wouldn't have happened if he'd been at primary school. It did happen at secondary school. But yes, I just wish that there had been perhaps people who were a little bit more aware than we were coming into it firsthand to understand about neurodivergence and to try and help support him rather than punish him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important message for our educators to hear at the moment. And I really do hope that many schools are taking an approach that is more supportive. And I think it is to do with awareness and understanding individuals' different needs within a school setting. And I know that that's hard to achieve in a secondary school because teachers are teaching so many different pupils and they are seeing potentially hundreds of pupils on a weekly basis. But having that adult that can be that listening ear and that supportive, trusted adult, I think is so important. Can we come back to social media and that having a phone? Because I know that this is something that a lot of parents will be concerned about. Is there a message that you'd like to share with parents who may be worried that their own child is getting very engrossed with different social media platforms or applications, or potentially their entire social life may be playing out through social media? Is there any advice you'd have for those parents?
I think through our lived experience, we've come to the conclusion, as are, I think, the majority of parents now and school settings and anybody who deals with young people, smartphones are absolutely addictive. The algorithms heighten that. Do be concerned about your child being online. They aren't safe. It isn't policed. And try as much as you can to, number one, not give them a phone in the first place, and then to be very clear on how much time they can have on them, and always be with them if you can when they're on that phone. It's so hard because we know with Olly what happened. He got his phone. It was never out of his hand. You couldn't get it away from him. It's almost, once they've got them, it's too late. All you can do at that point is always be that listening ear and that person that they can come to speak to if they come across something that's upset them. But it's that whole idea that they get desensitized so quickly that they don't really understand what's a danger and what isn't. But sadly, in our work through campaigning, we've been united with other bereaved parents, and we're part of a group called Bereaved Families for Online Safety. And tragically, every week it feels we get a new set of parents coming and joining the group with yet another horror that has happened to their child online. With the Bereaved Families for Online Safety, it was so important to us that the Online Safety Act was passed. That was 2.5 years ago. And it's now at the point where Ofcom are ready to actually regulate against that act. And the real hope is that we will see some changes and that children can be safer online.
And so that obviously is legislation and law, but what about parents? What can they do? Anoushka, you were telling me about a campaign earlier. What would you like to tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's a great initiative called Smartphone Free Childhood, which is a campaign encouraging parents and carers to collectively come together to reduce screen use for our children. Lots of schools who have adopted a phone ban throughout the school day have seen a marked increase in attendance and a huge decrease in detention. So we can see the effect that has on well-being for young people as well. It's a really important aspect that needs to be considered for all young people's safety and well-being.
Yeah, I can really see how powerful that would be, because I imagine that as a parent, if you've got your child coming to you and saying, but everybody else has got a phone, then how can you respond to that? You don't want to isolate your child. You don't want them to be left out of those social activities. But if all parents are saying, or all schools are saying, phones are banned here, then that's a very clear message. And that's very easy then for parents to say, well, actually, that's not true because we're part of this campaign. So Amanda, some of our listeners might not know what happened to Olly. Would you be able to tell us what did happen to him?
I can look back and see how Olly's world had become really quite small, and how we really didn't understand now the world that he was living in. But back on that Sunday afternoon, it was the 3rd of January 2021, Olly was in contact with the girl who had been kind of constant about that time. And he said that he was going to meet her over in Bugs Bottom, which is literally an open parkland just a few metres from our home. So we thought, okay, that's good, right? So off he went. What he didn't know, and we didn't know, was that over the past 48 hours, as a kind of a build-up on the back of something that Olly had done, children had been behind his back conspiring to lure him out of the house and to be able to attack him.
So it was a planned attack.
It was a planned attack by young children, young adults, young people. So Olly had seen it was on a WhatsApp group. There was a massive group of young people, and on it there was a clip of a young lad being patterned. And that patterned wasn't a term we'd ever heard of, but it's when you humiliate somebody and you film it and you use it to really blackmail them into doing what you would like to, or to elicit an apology. So Olly had shared a clip of a young man being patterned with his older brother, because he had seen the two boys that did end his life laughing about it. And that didn't sit well with Olly, because he wanted that young boy to be protected. And so, but they saw what he'd done and didn't like it. He was a snitch and a grass and a snake. And so that built up their momentum of anger. And it's not until we sort of saw these conversations playing out in the Thames Valley Police sequence of events that was taken to the Crown Court, because this was a murder trial. You could hear how they were winding each other up into more and more anger and violence, sharing images, the things they were saying that they were going to do to him. So this had all happened without Olly or us realising. First thing he knew was the girl wanted him to meet. So off he went into Bugs Bottom. But quite quickly, with him being in Bugs Bottom, the boys and other children with them came up the hill. And there was an argument. Olly wouldn't back down. There was a physical fight. Olly was coming off okay. And then the younger boy pulled out a knife and stabbed him twice. Once in his back and once in his chest.
I'm so sorry. And all because Olly had been standing up for another boy. Olly had been trying to protect another boy who'd been humiliated. And this is the response. And it's tragic. I mean, it's just above and beyond what you would have ever imagined an argument could escalate to. But this is the danger of online, that they can say and do what they want and there's no one listening in and there's no comeuppance. And I would say that if somebody had overheard those young people talking about in the way that they were speaking, something would have stopped them in their tracks to carry on and do what they did. But they did it, they left the scene immediately and were covering their tracks from the minute they did. And again, for children as young as 13 and 14 to have that foresight and to be able to do that, even that act, it's just horrific. I mean, it's unbelievable. Were they older than Olly or the same age as him?
Same age and slightly older. So Olly always got on with older children. He did. And so a lot of his friends were in the year above. His birthday was the 1st of November, so he was always the oldest one in his year anyway. So he got on with a lot of young people. And so all of the children were in the year above him that were involved in this. But it's only still a matter of months, really, between their ages.
I think that escalation is something that we've talked about, how things online can escalate very quickly. And I think that's a really interesting point that you've made about how if actual adults had overheard that conversation, safeguards would have been put into place. But as it was, it seemed to come out of nowhere to you or to your family, but they had been planning it and they had been talking about something or being violent. And it's so shocking. And I'm sure for many parents and people listening will find that very shocking.
They did. I think the ripple on effect in our community, thinking of our family and our friends, Olly's friends, the schools, it's just been such an enormous tragedy. We're coming up to 5 years ago now, but I think for everyone, it feels like it just happened. I don't think you ever get beyond that feeling of shock.
Mm-hmm. I think that's perhaps something that perpetrators of crime might not realise is the wider impact and the long-lasting impact and the life-changing impact that their actions can take.
Yeah.
What impact did it have on the community? And you say the community is still feeling the effects nearly 5 years later. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think for us as a family, the support was absolutely fabulous. And I think sometimes you can not know that the help that is there until you actually need it. But I think it shone a light into our community. Everybody who was involved with young people, the churches together, brought everyone together. And it started a lot of things now, which I just wish had been around before Olly passed. So in our local environment, now that we have mentors going into schools and outside of school for children that are struggling, more youth club and that interaction happening, but also links with the Ben Kinsella Trust that were never there before, through helping with training for our young people and for parents and those involved with young people. So there's so much more there. Our local police force, through their violence prevention partnership, have created information as well that's sent out to and even that's around sort of knife crime. But when you think about online safety, I think parents are so much more aware now, and so are schools, because of campaigns that have run.
Yeah.
And sadly, horror stories that are shared.
Just hearing you talk about, we didn't know what we were doing when we were giving our children smartphones. And, you know, my eldest son is the same age as what Olly would be. Yeah. And at that time, when we were just handing out smartphones to our children, thinking we were doing the right thing to keep them safer.
It was like, yes, that's exactly what it is.
And it's not now
until we gave him one to walk up to school to keep him safe.
Absolutely. And it's not now, with tragic hindsight, that we look back and we think, wow, what damage are we doing to our children, to our young people? And it's because of people like yourself that speak up and continue to speak about what happened, to educate other parents, that helps parents make really informed choices.
I'm hopeful for future generations, but I think when I look at Olly's generation, and like you're saying, your son, and there'll be so many that have managed to have had to survive it and get through it. I feel angry at what they've seen and what has desensitized them, and that will ripple out into our society.
I think that's why it's really important that we're sharing Olly's story, and it's really important why we keep talking about it and campaigning. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Ben Kinsella Trust and your work?
Yeah, sure. So the Ben Kinsella Trust was set up in 2008 after the tragic murder of Ben Kinsella. Ben was a 16-year-old boy walking home after celebrating the end of his GCSEs with his friends when he was attacked in a completely unprovoked attack where he was stabbed 11 times in 5 seconds. He was able to get around the corner where his friends were waiting for him. Sadly, when he was taken to hospital, he lost his life a few hours later. So the trust was set up to really educate young people on making positive choices around safety. We also campaign for action and justice for those affected by knife crime. We have a vision that we will have a society free of knife crime, and we'll do that through education, awareness, campaigning and collaborating and supporting other people, because that's how we need to do this as collective action.
I agree. I think that's really, really important. And in fact, one topic that has come up, which I think connects to Olly's story, is this idea of being a snitch, this idea of telling on somebody, this idea that you are somehow a coward if you are snitching, or you're getting a bad reputation for snitching. How can we dispel that myth and change the narrative around that topic?
Well, it's exactly that. It's changing the narrative. So having conversations with young people about what it is to be a snitch. Snitching is often seen as a really bad thing, done for negative reasons and has negative outcomes, whereas sharing information,
Reporting something.
absolutely, is done for positive reasons, positive outcomes. You're being an active bystander. Lots of young people don't realise where they can share that information anonymously, and fearless.org is a great organisation where they can share that information, and it will go to the right services that can safeguard young people. So
Anonymous as well, isn't it?
100%. So if a young person knows someone's carrying a knife, or hears that someone's threatening to do something to someone, but doesn't want to tell a teacher or a parent, but has this information that could keep someone safe, they can go to fearless.org and just type in their answer, close it down. There is no tracking to that child's device or laptop or anything.
I think that's brilliant to have shared that. And I think this message that you're not snitching, you're reporting to keep somebody safe. You're keeping somebody safe, or you're keeping a community safe, a family safe, who may suffer the consequences of somebody's wrong choices. I know, Amanda, that you've continued to campaign through a program called Olly's Work. Could you tell us more about that?
Oh, I think for us, Olly's work has been a godsend, and the last of 4 and a bit years, it's really been our focus and given us something to really feel quite proud of. We are setting up a charity, the Olly Trust. Olly's work has been around campaigning, fundraising, and it's focusing on the areas that affected Olly, so anti-knife crime, online harm, and the fact that he was neurodiverse. What's important to us is that we keep doing the work that we do. We love working with the Ben Kinsella Trust. We can see what a difference the way that they educate into our communities, what a difference that makes. We found that Olly's work's grown really quite organically. So it started out very much with campaigning and working with other bereaved parents. That carries on now, but it's led into us doing presentations and assemblies into schools, or for head teachers, those in safeguarding leads. We're happy to do that, to share Olly's story and any advice that we can give into our communities. I think raising awareness, we would love everybody to know. Yeah, it sounds unusual to say this, but we want everyone to know what happened to Olly, because there are so many lessons to be learned. I hate the fact that we were so naive as parents and we didn't protect him better. And I think what we've learned is that unless everybody works together to make a difference for our young people, nothing will change, and we desperately want things to change for the better.
I think that it's such a powerful message to be sending to parents who may be very, very worried about this topic and worried about their own child and what they might be accessing online. Anoushka, I wonder if you can tell us more about the Ben Kinsella Trust and how you can support schools and parents with different resources.
So we already have our exhibitions throughout the UK where we run our Choices and Consequences workshops for young people. We also have tons of online resources for teachers, youth workers, parents and carers. We've got lesson plans for teachers and school staff around various topics on staying safe, knife crime and gangs. We also have a really useful document that can be downloaded, our guide for parents and carers on knife crime and safety. Anyone can read that document. It's really useful if you're a member of school staff, a teacher or a parent. At the end of that document, there's a really helpful list for the organisations that we recommend and support.
That's brilliant. And I should say that we will provide links to all of those different organisations in the description notes of the podcast so that listeners can have access to those. So I wanted to say thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing Olly's story and for continuing to share his story with schools and educators and parents, and for the work that you're doing to try and make communities safer. And also to you, Anoushka, and for all the work that you're doing here at the Ben Kinsella Trust and the support that you are bringing to schools. We've been in the exhibition centre today. It's absolutely fantastic. I know that so many pupils will be coming through these doors and learning about the different aspects of knife crime and hopefully helping them to make better choices in the future. So thank you both very much for being here today. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to check out the National College platform, where you will find other trending podcasts, blogs, webinars, and courses, ensuring that you can stay up to date with all the developments in the education sector. Thanks again.